everyone, Joe from GBE Reviews. Sorry for the delay in posting. I was sick for a while and my voice was a big shot and everything I tried to record just sounded like crap. So the good news is that in that time I finished the much anticipated Libra the Vampire Princess, and boy do I have to say, meh. I'll give you a warning that I only played Kaylin's route, as she appealed to me most, and honestly I found the other two characters a bit obnoxious, and I just couldn't bring myself to go back, but I think this review will give you a pretty good gist of the overall story just from that one perspective. Alright, so let's start with the good. First, the graphics are done really well. It's in the modern style of graphics that looks really good and crisp. Also, the fight scenes are done really well with a ton of cool special effects, and some of the backgrounds are just breathtaking. I mean, look at this. Man, Edis is just gorgeous, and some of these screenshots can just blow you away. Plus, the voice actor, especially during the big final scenes, just the way she spoke really low and husky, still sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. And speaking of Edis, I loved her as a main villain. She's like someone you love to hate, and you almost feel a bit bad for her. You don't get basically any background on her whatsoever, but you still get a sense she's a bit sad and lonely, and by the end I just couldn't find myself disliking her no matter what atrocious thing she did. Alright, so what else? I guess one interesting mechanic is the ability to remove clothing from all the sprites with a click of a button. Basically, you click the little Pantsu icon in the lower left corner and boom, everyone's naked. When I was bored of a scene, I'd sometimes click it on and off and laugh at the absurdity of a completely naked set of girls in school talking just about random nonsense. Alright, so what else? I mean, I guess the world is fairly interesting. There's vampires, a religious organization, a werewolf maid. Certainly the world is pretty dynamic. Add in the fact that the characters evolve over time, and Shuma is a solid protagonist, and you get a pretty interesting dynamic. So one thing is Shuma is destined to turn into the progenitor, basically some like really big vampire leader who's supposed to like balance out the world because he's going to be so powerful. So the way he reacts with each of the three main girls is really interesting because he doesn't want to change, he wants to stay a human. So you have Oi, who really wants him to stay as a human, so as long as he's fighting that urge and not sucking blood or doing any of the bad things, she'll side with him and fight with him. You have the maid, Mari, who thinks humans are bad. She doesn't really like them, so she thinks it's absolutely ridiculous he won't change. And then you have Kaylin, who, like, her whole mission is to go to him and get him to change. She's from one of the other three families, and she's kind of destined to marry him and them to end up together and him to kind of turn into the vampire lord. So each of them has different motives and motivations, and as Shuma kind of evolves, I can imagine through the different routes he takes different paths, but at least in the Kaylin route, she's pushing him towards this, and eventually that's where he ends up going. But I think those dynamics and how, because each of the characters feels a different way, that as he evolves from human to vampire, you definitely see some really interesting reactions between all the characters. I guess I'll have to add that the sound was really good as well. The voice actresses are all unique and the music's really good. All that works just great together. Alright, so unfortunately that wraps up the good. Now to get to the bad, and boy is there a lot of it. First, let's start with Lycodis. Boy, she is just awful. For some reason, when she's turned into a familiar and serves as kind of the secondary bad guy, she suddenly becomes like a bumbling fool who's kind of good at fighting but dumb as a bag of rocks. The way her speech pattern is presented is also really obnoxious. She has like blah 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 desu at the end of every single thing she says. It's the worst. As awesome as a villain that Edis is, Lycodis is just absurdly bad in the other direction. Speaking of her, I just hated the fight scenes in this as well. Granted, the special effects were good, but the pacing just felt slow and drawn out. Having come from games that did this well, like Cho Dengeki Striker, I couldn't really get into them. I was literally sitting bored during some of the fight scenes and filled with the urge to skip. And let me say that again. In the fight scenes of a game centered on action-adventure, the fight scenes, I was bored. I mean, come on, if you can't get that one thing right in your action-adventure game, like, what are you doing? That's the one thing you should get right. I mean, The graphics in something like, say, Princess Waltz were way behind in the times, but I was on the edge of my seat during those fight scenes. Versus this, I was just bored. Okay, so let's see. Alright, so the school scenes. So I just came off of reading 11 Eyes, and maybe that was a mistake because they're so similar, and 11 Eyes is done really well. But here, the school scenes, I don't know, I just couldn't really get into them. They weren't really that funny, and I don't know, they felt like filler to me, not like kind of a nice break from kind of the intense action like it was in 11 Eyes. It was more just like, what is this scene even really doing here? I get that there's a little evolution, and they're not all bad, but in general, the school scenes felt kind of, I don't know, they felt forced. Like, the game was too short without them, so they needed to add some of this just to fill out the game. And then there was, like, constant fighting between Oi and Shuma during the Kalen route, and that was kind of irritating. It's like, alright, so she'll jump behind him and try to stab him, and he'll dodge, and, you know, that same scene happened, like, literally half a dozen times. I was just bored of it by the end. Alright, another thing I found obnoxious was the choices. This VN basically sucked when it come to player choice. There's literally one choice, and I mean one choice, the entire VN. Not like one major choice, I mean there's just one choice. I'm serious, minus, I guess where you want to like freaking come during an H scene, I guess that's a choice too. But as far as story-driven choices, there's one. The premise is basically you want to go out on a night watch with someone, and the choice is, I choose to go with X, where X is the girl's route you're going to be on. So there's no choices that make you evolve with the character. There's no choices that make you kind of get closer to the girls or further away. Literally, it's just, alright, Pikachu, I choose you, and then that's it. That's the girl you end up with. It was definitely really disappointing, because 11 Eyes had tons and tons of choices, and unfortunately, I keep going back to that comparison. One, because I just read it, and two, because they're similar. They're playing in this, like, kind of supernatural vampire space. I don't know. Comparing it to that was overall disappointing. Alright, so another thing in general that frustrated me was just, I was confused about how the world worked. I mean, I get that vampires can make familiars, but for some reason, Shuma was too weak to make familiars. But he could somehow remove the familiar status from other girls, and that felt kind of weird to me. Also, at one point, Oi becomes insanely strong and seems to be possessed, and she fights against Shuma and claims later she was quote-unquote possessed by God. But I think maybe it was Edis who possessed her, but I'm not really sure. It wasn't explained well. So finally, in the final fight scene, it basically pulled a bunch of bullshit where Shuma was all of a sudden becoming a powerhouse and could do all sorts of amazing things he couldn't do before. I mean, I get that he kind of evolved to the progenitor during the final fight, but just because he has all this powers, how did he know how to use them all? Basically, he trained with Kalen a little bit before the final fight, but she got beat by Edis in like literally 2 frames. Like, it was just over before you even knew what happened. So, how could she teach him about all these important things that he learned during the final fight when she sucked and couldn't do any of them herself? So, I guess, to me it feels stupid that you all of a sudden intuitively know these things. Like, Shuma, this guy who's like 20 or so, is able to beat this 2,000-year-old vampire who has all these crazy tricks she can use. It felt to me really silly and like over the top, and you know the good guy has to win, but really I don't know, I didn't like it. I couldn't buy a 2,000-year-old vampire getting beat by some kid. And one other thing, the outro scene that happens kind of after you play the whole thing, there's kind of like one little outro scene. I think it was bizarre. I don't want to go into details because it's a bit of a spoiler about the ending, but I didn't understand how any of those things happened, and they were talking about some nonsense that it basically just took what was probably a pretty okay ending and just mucked it all up. Alright, no more bad, or otherwise I'm going to make nobody ever want to read it. And it wasn't that bad. I mean, it had a lot of weird things about it, and I'd say it's overall average, but I don't know. I'll go into that in a bit, but basically, let me wrap up the Ecchi section before I get too frustrated. The Ecchi was good. There were tons of H scenes with basically most of the female characters, and lots of different types of H scenes, so it didn't feel repetitive. If you're trying to kind of read something that has a good set of H scenes along with the story, I think that piece won't disappoint you. Also, I do have to add, there was like a weird pee fetish thing in there that's not my thing at all, but if you're into that, I don't know of many other visual novels that have that, so there you go. Since the girls overall were attractive and the scenes were done well, this ends up basically being the VN's one saving grace. Like, yeah, the graphics are good, and overall, it has some interesting moments, but the H scenes are probably the best done thing in the VN. Which is interesting because, granted, there's a lot of them, but, when you have a visual novel that has a 15 to 20 hour arc, the, hour and a half of H scenes you throw in, that shouldn't really be the best part, especially when you're an action-adventure VN and your fight scenes are boring. Alright, so one final thing, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this. This VN is basically solid graphics and music, but awful story version of Tsukihime. I mean, it has vampires, it has sex, it has a girl from the church who wears a blue church outfit, and can kind of do a cool holy nun transformation. Basically, I kept drawing parallels to that as well, and I was just thinking this kind of as a modern-day successor just disappointed me. So, granted, there were some good things, and I definitely suggest checking this out if you're into the genre. Like, if you like H-scene-filled, vampire-type, modern, or action-adventure stuff, if you're into that kind of thing, it's definitely worth a read, but you'll probably be disappointed, especially relative to really good works like Tsukihime and 11 Eyes. And if you're not into it, the pieces of it that are specific to the action-adventure, like the fight scenes and kind of the story world, some of those are kind of blah. So I guess, unless you're really into it, I would suggest probably passing on this one. Alright, so I think that pretty much wraps it up. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section, and please like and share and subscribe and all that jazz. As always, this is your host Joe, saying to you, Jeanne.
Oh, please don't let me die.